What's up, everyone? Dave Dustin here. Got another awesome video I'm about to make for you. This one's going to be all about the British Comics campaign. A lot of people know about the American Comics campaign against the horror comics in the early 1950s. Not very many people know about the British stuff, so I'm going to go over a whole bunch of documents and books and booklets, some really extremely rare stuff that I have here that you've probably never seen before. We'll go over the history of it all and try to preserve that history and let everyone know what's out there and what happened. And I got my first mail call of the year 2022. First package arrived. I'm going to open that up and show you what I got. This came in directly related to all this. Plus, because this is all about British comics, I changed up my rack behind me here. They have all British editions, all distributed in the UK. Every one of these comics, 40s and 50s. Most of it's American reprints. There's some original British stuff up there too. I switched that up to make this video. Anyway, to begin with, if anybody wants to know more about the British campaign against comics, you need to read A Haunt of Fears. This is by Martin Barker in 1984. It's 227 pages, all about the British comics campaign. You go through it and will give you everything you need to know about the British comics campaign is in here. It's a great read. You could just read this. I go through it for hours. I'm going to try and do something quicker though and just go through the booklets right now. So anyway, the British horror comics really started in the 1950s. Over there in the UK, they didn't have any horror comics really before that were full horror comics. They only had the one that I know of. First horror comic ever is Classic Comics number 13, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This came out in the United States in August 1943. It is considered to be the first horror comic. It's all horror. Cover to cover, it's just one single story. They took the classic tale and they illustrated it. That would be the first horror comic ever, but they did not have this in the UK back in 43. They didn't come out with their reprinting of it until the 50s. So it was not the first horror comic that was found in the United Kingdom. The first horror comic that was found out there, that was distributed out there, would be Mr. Lucifer Comics. Not very well known, not many people over there even know about this. This would be the first horror comic, cover to cover, that was distributed in the UK, distributed by Streamline Books in London, England. It was published here in Canada. So this is published by Crestwood Publishing Company, 26 Denison Square, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It was actually, I think they just used that name. They used that company for paper rationing. They never published anything else other than this and Tally Ho, which were both from Bailey Publications in the States. It was actually published by Century Publications, also known as Superior Comics. Just that 1 year only, 1946, they did a whole bunch of comics. About 3 dozen of them. I know 19 of them that I've identified that are all glossy covered, but the covers are mix and match with the contents. Then they did, I know of 14, they published non-covered. So this never had a cover on it. This is what the cover was of the American original, 1945, Spook Comics by John Giunta. He also had a time as assistant, was a well-known at the time, really young, Frank Frazetta. That's the American cover. Canadian edition never had a cover. In the UK, they thought that this was a remainder comic from Canada. We did not ever have this out here in Canada. This was made by Century in 1946. They shipped dozens out to the UK to try and test international waters. They never did again after that. In 1947, they toned it right down and they just distributed in Canada for the next decade until 56 when they went out of business. Anyway, Mr. Lucifer Comics. It's got a couple adult horror stories, like a devil kills a bunch of people. The last story is about voodoo. The text story, Death in the Bathtub. It's kind of a crime story. Then they also have like Gregory the Ghost story. There's a story with monsters. Dr. Paul Bearer with Walking Dead. But they're more aimed at younger kids. They're more cartoonish. But still, first horror comic ever distributed in the UK, Mr. Lucifer Comics. Most of these have got thrown out because everyone thought they were just poor shape, incomplete, missing the cover. They never had a cover. This is the cover. So they were just destroyed, so many of them. I only know of 5 of these exist. Since my last video, I found a couple others existed from people online. But yeah, 1 of 5 right there. The next anthology style horror comic, that is multiple news stories, all horror related, cover to cover. Eerie Comics, number 1. It's a one-shot by Avon. January 1947. So a couple years later, Avon came out with this. They were all horrific horror stories. And this one actually got noticed. So the campaign really started in, say, 1950. The first literature I've been able to find about comics, like first anti-comic propaganda, would be in this. Juniors by George Pumphrey. This is a hardcover with a dust jacket. It's published in 1950. It's got 162 pages. There's a 10-page section on comics. So, page 50, reading in and out of school with special reference to comics. This is the first I can find of any literature that talks about comics at all. And part of this section talks about Eerie #1. After this, they came out with another #1 in a whole series, but this is the one-shot Eerie comic #1. So this is described in this book because a copy came over. They didn't have any published or distributed in the UK, but American servicemen that were stationed over in London, England area, someone brought one over and it made its way into a child's hands and then into George Pumphrey's hands here, who writes about it. I'll read you a little bit of this one paragraph. One magazine, which I borrowed from a 9-year-old girl, was called Eerie, and it certainly lived up to its title. The drawings throughout were remarkably clever in conveying an eerie atmosphere. The first story dealt with a madman who kept a tiger as a pet. The tiger tasted human blood and chased his master through the house and into the garden, where the man finally died of fright. The second story told of a man who sold his soul to the devil and showed his last hours when he was trying to escape death. The third story was about a crew of an aircraft which crashed on an island and told how the airmen were captured by the natives and sacrificed to man-eating lizards. The fourth story dealt with a haunted house where a man was found hanging by the neck and searchers were attacked by a madman. The last story showed a man being unmercifully bullied by his wife with a gruesome close-up of the bleeding scratches down his face. He decided to murder her and pushed her in front of a tube train. This is shown in detail. He was overcome by fear and committed suicide. This bare verbal account tells nothing of the horrible vividness of the drawings. This type of American magazine is bad for children, and parents should do their utmost to see that their children do not read them. So that's the earliest anti-comic writing I could find. It's in this book, 1950, a really rare book. This is the only copy I've ever seen anywhere. It is referenced in his other writings, so later on. And then that brings us to my mail call, which just arrived recently. I just opened it up already to make sure everything was okay. And as you see, I just got a copy of Lure of the Comics. So Lure of the Comics, this one here is by the Women's Day Committee, April 1952, and is 12 pages. You look inside, talks about Lure of the Comics, what the comics teach, why the comics appeal, the fight to protect our children. We have the power to fight this. So that's really cool. I just opened this up. This is really awesome. I'm so glad to have this. See, well, it's got some staple stains on the back from transfer from something else. But there's an ad on the back I'll read to you. This is the exhibition. The striking exhibition illustrating the conditions which give rise to the appetite for comics and the probable effects of such comics on children is now available for hire. 6 screens, each measuring 5 feet by 4 feet, with material on both sides, provided with legs for freestanding. So that's talking of an exhibit that went from town to town, apparently. That's really awesome. Lure of the Comics. I've been looking for this for a while. It's kind of funny how I found it. I'd heard of another one for sale back a few, 3-4 years back. I heard My Comic Shop, I think it was, had an auction. And I know someone who won the auction, and he had a second copy, an under copy that I was offered, but it had a detached cover. And I wanted a better looking one, so I held off. I didn't get that. I saw one went for sale in September that I bid on in the UK, Phil Comics on eBay. I missed out on that one. Somebody had posted right at the end of the year in December that they found one at the start of the year on Abe Books. And Abe Books is like it's a website you can search up looking for books from bookstores that are all linked to this all over the world. And he said he found a copy. And then he also talked about that one that sold in September. And if you want to read this online, the one that sold in September on eBay, the person uploaded scans of all the pages. And there's a couple websites on the internet where people have put the pictures that were uploaded in September. So you can read this entire booklet online real easily. Just find that. And then, yeah, so I saw this, and right at the end of the year, I saw this post. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to search up Lure of the Comics on Abe Books to see if there's any for sale. Just like that other guy did. And sure enough, I found one for sale. It was located in the United States. It wasn't too far from where I am. And I called up John Sanderson, antique bookseller, and worked out a deal, and I got this. It's fantastic. I've been looking for this for years. That's great. Lure of the Comics. So that was around April 52. After that, about a month after, they ran an article in Picture Post, May 1952. And inside that was an article, Should U.S. Comics Be Banned? I don't have the actual post, but I got these pictures offline. Here's the article. You see Women Outlaws. See some Walking Dead. There's some more Walking Dead, some more murder. There's the other page of the article. So that ran in Picture Post. So that would have been seen by a lot of people. That's a national syndicated magazine that was big back then, and a lot of parents would have seen that and taken notice of that article, and that would have really, given a nice kick to the campaign there. And it went on through the 50s, and more horror comics just kept getting published. Like through the 50s, you see like Ghostly Weird, Frankenstein, Tales from the Crypt, Comics Hold You Spellbound, Adventures into Weird Worlds, Suspense Magazine, Frankenstein Startling Terror, the Bat Magazine, Eerie. There's a lot of comics. There wasn't really that many compared to the United States. The United States had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horror comics that came out in the 50s. In the British market, there was like 40 that came out. It was pretty short-lived there. So they came out with these. They kept coming out, and then that was 52. So in 1954, Comics and Your Children. So this booklet came out by George Pumphrey, 1954. And everything was ramping up then. So in 1954, that's when a lot of groups were starting to fight the horrible horror comics. My reasons for writing this pamphlet, it goes on. If you're looking for these smaller pamphlets, I've uploaded them all on the internet. I know you can find them. If anyone's on Facebook, the group EC Fanatic Club, you just search up the names of these pamphlets, and I've uploaded pictures of all of them already. What are these comics? The British comics, the sales of British comics, American type comics, the present position of comics in America. How did these American type comics get into Britain? We got a picture here. We got Tales from the Crypt, Planet Comics, another Tales from the Crypt. Got some other comic shown. It goes on. British publishers of American type comics. Who sells these comics? Who buys them? How are children affected by them? How can harmful comics be eliminated? Then on the back, I'll read you what's on the back of this. The following is quoted from a recent statement issued by the National Union of Teachers. It is a battle on many fronts, and the teachers cannot win alone. Let the publishers, the churches, the news agents, and all who are concerned with the problem join forces to remove this corrupting influence from the bookstalls in the dingy back streets. But let us remember, too, that it is not enough to destroy something evil unless there is something good to put in its place. Teachers can encourage good reading habits, but the public must do their part by seeing that every child has access to good books at school, in the library, and at home. The campaign is only half won when the evil comics are no longer a threat to our children. Then for further information about the activities of the Comics Campaign Council can be obtained from the Honorable Secretary, Dr. Simon Yudkin. So his name pops up a lot too. Simon Yudkin, George Pumphrey. They're well known in the campaign over there. So that would come out in 1954. What else came out in 1954 in the United States, of course, is Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Frederick Wortham, April 19th, 1954. And that just set a firestorm in the United States when that came out. That was like the death of comics, was that book, of course. So the campaign was going full tilt by that point. Then I got this other interesting little article. It's a leaflet, just a one-pager. I don't even know where this would have come from or where they would have distributed this. I have no idea, but it's from the Comics Campaign Council. There's an article from the newspaper, Sadism for Kids. And it was originally published in the New Statesman and Nation, September 25th, 1954. And that's the full article that was in the paper. And then there's this written on the back. So I'll read what's written on the back here for you. A message from the Comics Campaign Council. So we're looking at this here. Over 300 million comics are sold every year in Britain, and each one probably has an average of about 8 readers. The majority of these comics are harmless, but an increasing number are vicious and sadistic and filled with horror, crime, war, and sex. They are mostly printed here from matrices imported from the USA. Many parents, teachers, and others concerned with children have been anxious about this problem, and it was to bring these people together for more effective action that the Comics Campaign Council was established last year by the National Committee for the Defense of Children and the London Federation of Parent-Teacher Associations. We have since been joined by a number of other parent-teacher associations, by religious and other bodies, and by individual writers, teachers, and parents. The Council set itself 3 main tasks. 1, to make known as widely as possible the nature of these comics and to show how they differ from the traditional comics of our childhood. 2, to join with all other organizations who wish to discourage and finally stop the production and sale of these publications. 3, to encourage the production of more wholesome literature for children and to help children to develop their interest in good literature. We supply speakers, exhibition material, information, and advice to individuals and organizations concerned with the problem, and we help to promote meetings. A large number of organizations have already made use of these facilities. In addition, a panel of prominent writers, educationists, psychiatrists, and others who deal with children is being set up to examine comics, submitted to them by publishers, and to give constructive criticism of them. Their conclusions will be publicized as widely as possible. We have been greatly encouraged by the recent developments in the campaign, but much still remains to be done. All organizations and individuals who are prepared to assist in this work are asked to communicate with the Secretary, Dr. Simon Yudkin, and then see over. Now this must be extremely, extremely rare. People didn't even keep the booklets, really. How many people keep this single page of paper leaflet? I only know that 2 exist in the world for sure because I had 2 of them. One of them I sold off to the same person that had the 2 copies of Lure of the Comics in the United States. So he has the other one of these that I found from the same person over in the UK. But other than the 2, I don't know of any others that exist of this leaflet right here. So that's really cool. So then after that happened, a little while later, there was an exhibition held in November 1954. So here's a photo from it. They looked at some comics. And the caption that went with this picture, November 11th, 1954, teachers hold horror comic exhibition. A horror comic exhibition organized by leaders of National Union of Teachers was held at their headquarters at Hamilton House WC1 today. It is felt a display will be valuable since many people have not seen horror comics, even though there's a going feeling that some action should be called for to prevent their publication. MPs have been invited to the exhibition. Photo shows a display of pages from one of the horror comics at the exhibition today. And then, I'm not sure if they're referring to that one, or they may be referring to this one, because here's another picture from a board with the comic pages that have been cut up and put onto a board. These pages are out of the British edition of Adventures into Weird Worlds #1, and it's got a couple of stories in it from Marvel Comics, from Spellbound 5 and Astonishing 15. Here's another photo. So these are members of Parliament over there. They're looking at them. And there's a mixture of British and American comics, which is kind of strange. Also, it's got for the EC comics there, it's got Tales from the Crypt #1, the British. And it's got Shock Suspense Stories #10, the US copy. And then there's a Tales from the Crypt #2, British. Haunt of Fear #1, British. And it's got the American Tales from the Crypt #42. It's a mixture of British and American comics that were all from around 1951 to 1954. And here's a caption that I went with this one. Parliament secretaries look at horror comics. November 13th, 1954. So 2 days after that last picture. London, England, D.F. Vosper, British Parliamentary Undersecretary to the Ministry of Education, and Sir Hugh Lucas Tooth, Undersecretary to the British Home Office, are viewing a selection of horror comics on display at the National Union of Teachers office in London. A determined drive is underway to eliminate such productions from the newsstands. Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill is interested in the drive and has requested that he be given some of the horror productions for his display. So there's that. Also, along with that, in the middle of one of those displays was this Planet Comics, and someone zoomed in, took a photo of that. And then this photo as well, which is Ronald Goulden, the Secretary for the National Union of Teachers. He's holding the British Frankenstein #5, but then he's holding the American Haunt of Fear #23, even though there's a British edition with the same cover. So it's strange that he's holding the American edition, but anyway. And he's holding the American Astonishing #28. So once again, a mixture of American and British comics were at the displays. So that was in November. And then they started drafting a bill. They knew that an act was coming. They knew they were going to get shut down, the horror comics. Arnold Book Company made the Tales from the Crypt, the Haunt of Fear, and they also did the Startling Terror Tales. They did the Ghostly Weird. They would have done the Vault of Horror, but it was never published. But they came out with this letter. This is the death notice for comics. I'll read this to you. This is from Arnold Book Company, 2 Lord James Street, Piccadilly, London. Mr. D. Longhurst, Riverside, 21 Kingston Road, Ewell, Surrey. December 29th, 1954. So this is right at the end of the year. Dear Sir, herewith please find Tales from the Crypt #2 and Black Magic #16, which are our latest and last issues. As you are probably now aware, all printing of this type magazine has now ceased. Under the circumstances, we are returning herewith the postal orders that you have sent us, with the exception of 15D, which is for magazines you have been sent. Thanking you, we remain, yours faithfully, P.P. Arnold Company Limited, signed by the Secretary. So, this here was sent out to distributors in like the London, England area, and that from Arnold Book Company, telling them that they came with the last 2 issues they published, Tales from the Crypt #2 and Black Magic #16. So they had already advertised in their comics the Vault of Horror #1, another EC comic, and they advertised Black Magic Album #2. Neither of those were published. So they received a refund that came with this. Doesn't say for how much, but they received a refund for those ones not published, and the exception of 15D. So they paid 15D for a pile of comics that were sent. But that is basically the death notice of comics in the UK. And what's really, really cool is I researched this, and the distributor that was sent this letter, Mr. D. Longhurst, that was an undertaker. How crazy is that, to be reading horror comics while surrounded by dead bodies? This is, D. Longhurst was an undertaker, the bottom of a hill. There was a lumberyard attached, but after the lumberyard burned down, it just stayed as an undertaker business. And even in current times, it is an undertaker business. They had kept the name, the next owners, they still, even though it wasn't owned by the family anymore, that was an undertaker that was distributing horror comics in the 1950s. And then shortly after that, they came out with the act. It was the Children and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act 1955, It got royal assent May 6th, 1955, and its commencement was June 6th, 1955. So they had already stopped publishing them, but as of June 55, it was illegal because of the Harmful Publications Act that they had over there. You couldn't distribute those kind of comics. But then after that, this book came out. Children's Comics, A Guide for Parents and Teachers, came out in 1955. So in the United States, they already came out with the Comics Code Authority. They already killed off comics. Just like in the UK, you couldn't publish or distribute the horror comics as of June 1955. But even before then, the end of 1954, they stopped producing horror comics in the United States. The next few months, they could still publish stuff they had already drawn up, ready to go. But as of mid-1955, there were no more horror comics. They were completely banned under a comics code. And if you didn't have code seal of approval on your comics were not distributed. They were sent back in bundles, and distributors did not want to handle them because they weren't approved by the comics code. So anyway, 1955, this came out. George Pumphrey again came out with this book. Children's Comics, A Guide for Parents and Teachers. It's a pretty cool book. You see, it's got 78 pages. It's all about comics, and it's about the ratings of comics. He goes over a lot of stuff. It's a neat book that came out. And after that came out, British Comics An Appraisal. So this came out 1955. It's by Miss P.M. Pickard and the Comics Campaign Council. There couldn't possibly be many of these around. I've only ever seen one other copy. There's a copy online. Strangely, the heart, mine's just dots, just black and white. But this other copy, the heart's colored in red, and there is no dots. I don't know if that means two separate printings. I don't think they would have gone to two separate printings, but you never know. But there is a colorized one. Mine's just in black and white. So this is by the camp. This is 32 pages. It reviews comics that were published between June and October 1954, but this wasn't itself published until 55. It tells about so they studied comics, the crime and horror comics, Eerie, Unusual, Manhunt, Perfect Crime, Down with Crime, so on. And then the other comics they compared them to were the clean British comics, which were Swift, Girl, Eagle, Topper, and Dandy, and Beano. But it's a neat booklet. This page here talks about comics of the investigation, horror and death. Horrific and extreme. So far-fetched, horrifying, and disgusting would be unhealthy for adults. Descriptions of dead bodies walking and claiming victims. It goes on. It tells you how you rate it. A or B or D or E, depending on how bad it is. So, of course, the British comics got A's and B's, and then the American comics got D's and E's, like Eerie, E, D. There were too many bad men in it, said one boy. One adult. Horrific pictures. Descriptions of dead bodies walking and claiming victims. It just goes on and on. It's a fantastic little booklet. 55. And then finally, I have this. From Comics to Classics. So this came out November 3rd, 1956, and it's 10 pages. It's a program book that they had. This must be extremely rare. Here, I'll just put it over here as well. Just got some advertisements, some more advertisements, but then in the middle, the program of conference. So this is really neat. I like this. This is one of my favorite pieces because it has notes. Somebody took notes, which is really fantastic to have those notes. It talks about some key points made by some speakers. It names some speakers. Like that stuff is lost in history. Nobody knows who was there that was speaking except for now with these notes. You know, who was there and what someone said. A lot of it's shorthand, so it's really hard for me to read. Like it has like SCH for school, LIB for library, CHN for children and whatnot. But I can tell you what some of it says. So talks about up here, in school or in libraries, children in rural areas, books at home or school, using adult libraries, space for children's libraries, new towns. And then from comics to books, varying standards, access, NB. We've failed with ages 14 to 22. So they've already failed with one generation. Let's do better with the next. Go down here. I'll skip that one. I'll go to the next one. Reading and television. Speaker unconfirmed. It was the head of BBC. It looks like Adele Service and Mr. Scuffin. It's really hard to read. Then books in the home. Read in bed. Overcrowded living conditions. It says reading rooms and libraries and schools are in evenings. Retired teachers with a question mark. And down at the bottom it names a bunch of speakers. There was Mr. Humphreys, pictorial versions of classics. In history, yes, there is a place. Mr. Heel, primary schools and public libraries in all schools they're talking about. The Taylor. There's Mrs. Dumley, a diamond teacher. Mrs. Burgess. Can't tell what it says. There's a Mr. Rubenstein, a teacher. Mrs. Phelps, TWC. Mrs. Collier, a teacher. And my favorite remark of all, this always makes me laugh when I read it. Right here in the middle. From the Reverend Marcus Morris, the editor of Eagle, Girl, Swift, and Robin. It says, can comics help? So when commenting about comic books, he had made the statement, or part of the statement was, they are not either comics or books. That's fantastic. I like having these notes here. It's great. Being able to see that stuff that somebody actually wrote that was at the conference at the time. And you can see the advertisements are all geared towards good comics and good books. Like this one here, from comics to classics, we don't pretend to be able to wean children from the pernicious influence of horror comics, but we can offer them, once they have got onto books, a wide range of volumes amongst which they will be able to find the book of their choice. So they're still smearing the horror comics, even though it's 1956. Everything was done. Everything was already done in 1955, and so this is, as far as I know, the very last thing that has any kind of literature about anti-comics campaign. This has to be it, because there was just nothing going on. By this point, television was a new enemy. There wasn't comic books that was affecting children anymore because they were all sanitized already for over a year at that point. No, it was television is what's turning all the children into juvenile delinquents. So that would be the last piece right there. That's some great comic history. Hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.